So I started playing Yu-Gi-Oh! GOAT format earlier this year. And I gotta say, I've been having a lot of fun with it. I will also be speaking from a person that just got started into the format that learned a lot of interactions and comparing it to modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. So you at least have a reference at that point. Real quickly, GOAT format is basically a metagame based off from April 2005's ban list, almost 20 years ago. There's a lot of great things with that metagame too, and it still has a growing community in itself. And at the end of the video, I'll share some resources that helped me really get started well on this format and learn some of the cool interactions and rulings that I'll also cover with specific cards in this deck list too. GOAT Control is a deck that wants to utilize its resources in card advantage, but also game state, such as board state. It plays out as a control style deck, so that way you can get to your win con. And thanks to cards such as Snatch Steal and Thousand Eyes Restrict and other cards that are similar, you're able to get around difficult threats or also use your opponent's resources against them. We also have power cards such as BLS, Aeronautic Parashov, and of course you have other tribute summon monsters that you can play as well. Check out Dueling Guard's deck boxes, playmats, and binders. The great quality products that are anime based. They continually have more anime options becoming available. Use the affiliated link in the description for a 5% discount on your next purchase. Starting with the monsters, so we have BLS, and BLS is a phenomenal monster because it's 3000 attack. If we think back with GOAT format, you had to really utilize your normal summon, but also setting cards that have flip effects too. And in a way, the format is slower compared to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because you can only do so much. There's not as much special summoning, if not at all. In fact, there's not too many graveyard effects as well. And because you only are able to like normal summon typically, what I found out, 1500 attack monsters that are able to be normal summoned are pretty respectable. 1500 and plus. This card lets us attack twice and potentially hit 3000 life points as well, or get rid of a second monster. But one of the things that I want to slow down with this deck is its banishment effect. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There's such thing as called priority. That is for the player. It can be referred as player priority essentially. In GOAT format, it actually includes ignition effects in player priority. So when you special summon BLS, and if the summon was not negated by a card like, let's say, Solemn Judgment, you're past that summoning window, but now as you special summon it onto the field, you get to activate the banishment effect as Chain Link 1. Then your opponent has the option to chain a card such as Torrential Tribute or even Ring of Destruction to try to get rid of it. But this is so key because you're able to at least get some use out of BLS before it gets destroyed by your opponent's card effects. You get to banish something that can be troublesome, and oftentimes it does the job for you. I'll also link a resource more on the player priority and explaining how that works too in the description of the video as well. As we go with the rest of the deck, think of lights and darks to feel for BLS as well. We are playing 2 copies of Aeronautic Parashov. This card is a 1900 beater essentially that can get over most cards, especially if they're in defense mode. Either they're set or by Book of Moon or Tsukuyomi effects. And it does piercing damage, so you're able to trinkle your opponent's life points. And if you do battle damage, you get to also draw a card. So over time, this card can actually have a draw engine to recuperate your advantage or even just get ahead of your opponent as a snowball type of effect, essentially. If your opponent doesn't deal with this really quickly, this can become a problem for them. 1 copy of Saborg, the Thunder Monarch, and so I was playing 3 Parsha before, trying that list out as well. But as I noticed, in recent years with GOAT format, there's been a popularity usage of Gravekeeper Spy. This card has 2000 defense, which is higher than Parshov's 1900 attack, essentially. Not only that, it has an effect when it's flipped face up. So I wanted to use a card such as Saborg where it's able to be tribute summoned, but you can destroy a monster on the field regardless of its face up or face down. This gets around also types of cards that are recruiters, but also the flip effect monsters such as Magician of Faith or any jar cards as well. Also, this card can get rid of problem threats such as like BLS or Chaos Sorcerers and other big beaters essentially too, or even Thousand Eyes Restrict without the need to actually attack. Sometimes you can't attack because of Thousand Eyes Restrict's effect, or they have a Mare Force or a Sakurtsa armor that can stop your monster essentially. So I've been appreciating Zaborg a lot lately with this metagame. Onto the one-ofs. So we are playing one of Sangan, and so Sangan is essentially when it's sent to the graveyard from the field, you can just search for any card that's 1500 attack or less from your deck and add it to your hand. So it's a generic search, which is really nice. This also procs if you use Metamorphosis as the tribute, or if you tribute summon, such as like with Zaborg, this actually will go off as well. So you could basically float into another card and keep some advantage. At first, when I started playing GOAT format, if I had nothing to really summon appropriately, I would try to set maybe a Sangan face down. But what I learned, because of Nobleman of Crossout being heavily used in the metagame, especially if it's in the main deck or even side deck, it's going to get banished. So literally, it's okay to normal summon this monster in attack precision on your first turn and just pass, essentially. Your opponent may have to debate if they have to use a Snatch Steal or Mind Control, but at that point, is it really worth using a card like that for a little Sangan like that? So it's a lot of flexibility and it has a dark attribute as well. One copy of DDD Warrior Lady. So essentially this is a card that can get rid of problem threats that are bigger than you. It's okay if you take a little bit of life points, as long as you can get rid of a threat, then that's awesome. This also gets against recruiters such as like Shining Angel and Mystic Tomato as well. So they don't get their graveyard effects when they're destroyed by battle, essentially. It's also a light, and you could also technically play Reinforcements of the Army, but that's typically played in a warrior type of build. But again, this is a Sangan target, so we can search it. And it's a light as well. One copy of Sinister Serpent. So at first, when I started seeing deck lists for gold format, I saw this card and it's like, why? It doesn't really do much. Literally, during your standby phase, if this card's in your graveyard, add it to your hand. Okay, so what, right? Again, going back to gold format, you are taking multiple turns between you and your opponent, so over time, having some recurring card advantage actually can snowball into something advantageous for you. This is also a great target for cards like your Graceful Charity, or if your opponent uses a Delinquent Duel on you, because you could always get the Serpent back later on. Furthermore, this is a phenomenal card to use for discard trap cards such as Phoenix Wing Blast and also Regagi Break. A neat trick in ruling that I found out that if you do, during your standby phase, a Serpent that goes from your graveyard to your hand, you can activate a trap card such as those discard cards, discard the Serpent as cost, resolve the trap card, and then activate Serpent again to return it back to your hand. It's not a once per turn, which is really cool actually, because it's basically free fodder immediately. And also, if you have a second trap card that also discards, you can do the same thing again within the same standby phase. Resolve that trap card, and then again, use the Serpent a third time to come back to your hand. You literally have 2 discard traps that were free, essentially. Now, does that always come up? No, not necessarily, but I thought that was really cool and worth sharing as well. Unfortunately, it's not a light or a dark target, so it is a water type, so that doesn't help in that case. But it is a level 1, and that comes up because you can use Metamorphosis on it to go into Thousand Eyes Restrict. You oftentimes can set this card face down to safely activate a Metamorphosis at that point, so you can guarantee a monster to be able to tribute for that card. One copy of Breaker the Magical Warrior. This card has the ability to essentially get a counter, but you can use that counter to not only make you 1900 attack, which is pretty beefy on its own, but you can remove it to destroy any spell or trap on the field. This also includes field spell cards as well. So if you see your opponent only has 1 face down, you can safely use this card just to get rid of that card. And so you can commit more cards in case you're trying to make a push as well. You could also not use the effect immediately, and you can keep it as a 1900 beater, which will go over most monsters, or at least crash with some that are 1900 as well, such as like another Parsha, for example. It's a dark target as well. Ashura Priest. This card is really, it can destroy your opponent's monsters one by one, essentially, so it can attack multiple times in a single turn. You gotta remember that in this ban list, Regeki and Dark Hole are banned. There's no way to board wipe, essentially, of monsters, right? So if your opponent uses Scapegoat or maybe like Recruiter cards, you can keep attacking until there's no more, essentially. This comes up more with Shining Angel and Mystic Tomato because they're guaranteeing to summon in a card that's 1500 or less anyway. So you can still run it over because it's 1700. And at the end of the turn, this can go back to your hand because it's a spirit monster. It has niche scenarios too, because if it's the only monster that you have and your opponent's not really drawing much and they have an open field, you're constantly poking them for 1700, and if they have a card such as like Snatch, Steal, Mind Control, or Brain Control, they're dead cards. Because Ashura Priest basically just gets out of the field, and you keep summoning it when you need to and poke. Now onto the flip effect monsters, we are playing 3 copies of Gravekeeper Spy. So again, this card rose in popularity the past few years because beefy defense, it's a dark type as well, it's at level 4, so you could easily set it. And what it does when you flip summon it or it's flipped, you can special summon another Gravekeeper in defense mode or in attack mode face up. So you can basically just call another copy of itself. What's really nice about this is that essentially if your opponent doesn't attack your face downs the following turn, you can just flip summon it yourself. And now you have it where you can have another Gravekeeper Spy that's in defense mode. And then if you have other monsters that are in attack mode, if you attack and you get hit by a Mirror Force, you still have at least something to basically be like a mini wall, essentially. So you're not totally exposed. This is also a dark target, but it also is susceptible to a Nobleman of Crossout. And since you play 3 of them, any flip effect monster banished by Nobleman of Crossout, all players have to remove them from their decks as well. You see it as a bad thing, or as a way that if you really don't need the card in this moment, it was just something that you came across during that game state, you basically got rid of other cards to get closer to your other cards that were still left in deck, essentially. So in a way, kind of like deck denning in that sense too. So it's not the end of the world, essentially. But definitely watch out for Nobleman of Crossout when it's a disadvantage for you for sure. 2 Magician of Faith, and keep in mind even Gravekeeper Spy and Magician of Faith are both targets for Sangan as well. But Magician of Faith essentially gets you a spell card, so you can abuse cards such as Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Delinquent Duel a second time. And if you pair it off with cards such as like Tsukiyomi and Book of Moon, you can reuse the Magician of Faith again to be able to resolve more of those cards again. Literally last week as I was playing on Dueling Book, I was able to essentially use Pedigree 3 times in a single game. It's also a light target and it's level 1, so it's also a great metamorphosis target if needed. 2, Tsukuyomi, and so this card is also a spirit monster, so it'll go back to the end phase into your hand, but essentially when you normal summon it or it's flipped, you can choose one of the monsters on the field and flip it face down. It's a walking Book of Moon essentially, right? This is helpful because you can also turn big threats into face down position, and they can now be targeted with Nobleman Across Out. This also helps turn off Thousand Eyes Restrict, whether it be yours or your opponent's, and if it's your opponent's, they lose the equipped monster. If it's yours, let's say your Thousand Eyes Restrict was summoned the prior turn, you can then summon Tsukuyomi to flip yours face down. It'll lose the attached monster, but then you can flip summon it, and now you can steal another monster to be able to like just keep taking resources from your opponent at that point. And again, you can flip down your other flip effect monsters to reuse Gravekeeper Spy or Magician of Faith and so on. Another neat interaction that I learned is like with cards like Snatch Steal, Call of the Haunted, Premature Burial. If you Tsukuyomi onto them, cards like Premature Burial and Snatch Steal will go to the graveyard, and Call of the Haunted becomes a dead card. So they become disassociated with the monster essentially. However, you keep it permanently. It's like a permanent change of heart. So if you steal your opponent's BLS with a Snatch Steal, you can use Tsukuyomi to turn it face down, get rid of the Snatch Steal, but now you get to keep BLS without giving them life points every standby phase because of Snatch Steal. I thought that was crazy when I found that out. Transitioning into the spell card, so we are playing 3 copies of Book of Moon. So you may be asking, do you really need 3 copies? This card is very versatile, so it has all the benefits of Tsukuyomi already, but it's a quick play spell. So what that means is that you can now activate this during your battle phase. You can set this, and then during your opponent's turn, you can activate it during their turn. That's big. So if you think about it, like let's say your monster attacks your opponent, and they use a card like Sakurza Armor or Mirror Force where they target face-up monsters, you can use Book of Moon to protect your monster. Furthermore, if your opponent is trying to attack one of your monsters, you can Book of Moon them to essentially negate their attack. Another cool interaction is that if you have like a face-up Magician of Faith and your opponent's attacking it, you can Book of Moon your Magician of Faith face down. The attack still continues because there's no replay. And so essentially the attack into your Magician of Faith now that's flipped face down, and guess what? You get the benefit of Magician of Faith's skill. So you can get a Book of Moon back, or you can get another spell card that you really need during that game state. Also, if your opponent was using their own Thousand Eyes Restrict or a Snatch Steal, you can Book of Moon the Thousand Eyes Restrict so he can't steal your monster essentially. And then if you Book of Moon your own monster against a Snatch Steal, then your opponent can equip a spell card to it, so it fizzles essentially. Unfortunately, it doesn't get around cards such as like BLS or Regeki Break that actually just target a card regardless of position. So be wary of that. The last thing I want to say about Book of Moon is that if your opponent uses an MST or even a Heavy Storm, you can at least make usage of this card, potentially turning your cards face down or your opponent's and get some type of advantage still from it. This is better and more flexible than just having more trap cards in your deck because trap cards can be very specific, especially if they need your opponent to be attacking with a monster or something like that. So overall, Book of Moon's a very versatile card, and I highly recommend just like play testing it and trying out different scenarios for you so that way you can really see the full potential of it, or the Swiss Army type of effect, essentially, that it has. 2 Noblemen Across Out. So I've talked about this card. It gets rid of face down cards, essentially, and if they're flip effects, they're banished from the decks, both players, essentially, too. In this balance is limited to 2, so definitely play 2 in the main deck, especially since we utilize multiple copies of Tsukuyomi and Book of Moon. If you're going against a certain deck, such as Warriors, where they're not necessarily setting cards as much, you can discard this with like cards like Graceful Charity, or even Delinquent Duel if it was used against you, and you can set it out for games 2 and 3, essentially, as well. Not only you could get rid of big threats, but you could also get around annoying cards such as Recruiter cards, but also like DDD Warrior Lady or Reflect Bounder or maybe a Sinister Serpent, Sangan, and so on. So you have a lot of flexibility where it just makes sense to Noblemen Across Out that monster. So we have what we call as the Trinity. Essentially, it's Pedigree, Graceful Charity, and Delinquent Duel. Pedigree, draw 2. This card feels great when you play it. It's just like the anime, like, I draw 2 cards. Where Pedigree is illegal now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So you can't really use it. And again, just like I mentioned with Magician of Faith, you can reuse Pedigree multiple times in a single game. Graceful Charity helps you set up with a better hand, but also discard some cards for light and dark targets for BLS in this deck. And then the Delinquent Duel gets rid of 2 cards from your opponent's side, essentially. What's also cool about this card, especially if you're going first, you can use the Delinquent Duel to basically kind of get an idea of what your opponent's playing. Depending on what they discard, you can have an educated guess if it's something like Chaos Turbo or Warriors, or maybe like something like Burn or another type of archetype within GOAT format itself. This can give you some information at that point, so that way if you have a follow-up card such as like Graceful Charity, you know what to actually discard and what to keep, essentially. Also, it's worth noting that you can get it back with Magician of Faith later, especially if you know your opponent literally only has 2 cards left in hand. This will just get rid of the entire hand at that point. So we're playing 3 Scapegoat and 2 Metamorphosis, and so these pretty much come in a pair together. And essentially, with Scapegoats, you're able to have bodies that let you survive. If your opponent gets rid of your key monsters, you can chain it during their turn and summon the Scapegoats and take some attacks that way, but you can at least keep your life points safe, or maybe and still have 1 or 2 to follow up, where you can use Metamorphosis, then to use Thousand Eyes Restrict to take one of the monsters and swing it back at them at the crackback, essentially. Keep in mind, you can Metamorphosis other cards that are not just level 1, so it's not just like Thousand Eyes Restrict. Just to name a few, we have like Gatling Dragon for level 8, we have Thunder Dragon for level 7, Dark Bolter the Terrible for level 5, and it's a dark, and even Fiend Skull Dragon. These cards help negate certain spells or traps or effects in general too, which is actually pretty important. Even Ryu Senshi is a good level 6 target as well. There's more fusions, and also the fusion deck, it's not an extra deck, it's just the fusion deck, is unlimited too. So you can play more than 15 fusions if you want to, just to have everything that you need at any game, technically. Now for the spells that actually just steal your opponent's monsters, we have Snatch Steal, Brain Control, and Mind Control. Both Snatch Steal and Brain Control essentially need a face-up monster, where Mind Control can also target face-down cards. And Snatch Steal is typically the most versatile one because you can just steal what you need, and also you contribute it. You can not have to worry about paying life points yourself, although your opponent will gain 1,000 life points. But if you time it just right, you can get something that's going to do more damage, or you can just tribute summon into something or use Metamorphosis to go into something else as well. The Brain Control is something that I wanted to add because I was actually playing 3 Metamorphosis at first. And essentially, most of the time, Metamorphosis is going to get you Thousand Eyes Restrict, so you're going to steal something regardless. It's just a 2-card combo versus a Brain Control is just a 1-card combo. So then I started using Brain Control more. It's also very flexible, and you can tribute it. You can also attack with it if you need to be as well. Where Mind Control is more of the restricted type, it cannot attack and it cannot be tributed, but this is something that you could at least steal a face-down monster, and if you can time it just right, whether it be a Magician of Faith or a Gravekeeper Spy, you can use it to your own advantage and use it to grab your own spells. You can re-get the Mind Control to reuse it later, or you can use the Gravekeeper Spy to summon your own Gravekeeper Spy onto your field. This also helps just to make room to be able to make a push as well if you just need to get rid of a monster on their side of the field. And that could be the OTK turn, essentially, to finish off. 1 Premature Burial, and so in this metagame, we have Call the Haunted, and we have this card, but I'm playing this one because of the spell. You can use it immediately. Monster Reborn is banned, so you can't use that, unfortunately. But again, 800 life points, get a monster that you need. You can use it to revive a BLS that was properly summoned before, or use another card to be able to tribute summon to get Parshoff or Zaborg and pop off from there. Or maybe you need to revive like a DD Warrior Lady that was discarded by a Delinquent Duo, or any card that you really need. We have Heavy Storm and MST. So Heavy Storm is legal in this format, and so if your opponent has 2 or more cards on the field face down for spells and traps, this is a good value most of the time, especially if they're all trap cards. Best bang for your buck, right? And MST is a 1-for-1 essentially, but that could be timed just as right, especially with MST since it's a quick play. If you set this, your opponent has to see if it's an actual threat or it's just something that isn't as threatening. And then if they set something at the end of their turn, you can chain this immediately to destroy it without them being able to activate it just yet, essentially. Onto the trap cards, there's Mirror Force, Ring of Destruction, and Circuitsar Armor. So Mirror Force and Circuitsar Armor really depend on your opponent attacking you. Mirror Force takes out multiple face-up attack monsters, and then Circuitsar Armor just gets rid of the attacking monster. But it's still really good. A Ring of Destruction also destroys monsters, and it's more flexible. In the Errata during Go format, you can use it on your turn or your opponent's turn, and it doesn't matter what life points you guys have. You can actually end the game in a draw as well. But you could also just time it well where you're attacking your opponent directly, and you're short 1 more attack, but if you already have a Ring of Destruction that's set, or you set it that same turn, you get a chance to activate it eventually to destroy one of your own monsters and then put your opponent to 0 immediately at that point too. So the destruction effects are just very appreciative, especially you need to get rid of like big threats as well. And then lastly, 2 copies of Trap Dust Shoot. And so at first I didn't understand why people were playing this card even in the main deck. And as you read it, if your opponent has 4 or more cards, you get to see their entire hand and then return 1 monster back to the deck. So you still get a 1-for-1 essentially, unless they have a hand with no monsters. That's when you minus technically. But there are 2 things just to consider. 1, you get to see your opponent's hand so you can get an idea of what they really have, and if they can do anything about it. They can give you an advantage already, especially if you start this off during your first turn where you set this and then it's their turn, and then boom, you already are off to a good start. But also against Chaos Turbo, which has been seeing a lot of representation during these past few years, they rely on the graveyard where they need to have lights and darks. So cards like Thunder Dragon, for example, or even Night Assailant get to really like discard themselves, or they have effects when they're discarded essentially. But if you dust shoot them, those cards go back to the main deck, and it can essentially make their hand not great, especially if they're playing multiple Chaos Sorcerers and a BLS in their deck. They could potentially not be able to do anything. So I'm main decking too, but if you don't like Trap Dust Shoot, you could always just put it in the side deck and play a different trap card. Cards like Call of the Haunted, Solemn Judgment, Dust Tornado, and other types of cards are very valid points as well still. And so that's the deck profile. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. I wanted to take the time to really explain some of the nuances, especially if you're somebody that's starting off in GOAT format and never really had the chance to play in this format in time. It's like, where do you start and where's your frame of reference? So as mentioned with the resources that really helped me, check out GOAT Format's website. It's super phenomenal. It's well organized too. Basically the roles, individual rulings, you got deck lists, the different types of decks. There's actually a bunch of archetypes that you can try out for yourself that are technically in different tiers too within its own metagaming essentially. They also have the YouTube channel. So shout out to JDZ. I like his genuine personality too. He's a really cool guy. And he does a phenomenal job on just covering topping deck lists. And there's actually events every couple of weeks actually. And they also have like invites to the World Qualifier for GOAT format. So even though it's not necessarily through Konami itself, they're still hosting their events and running their own tournaments and also Worlds level type of tournaments too. This could be also online as well, mainly with Dueling Book, for example. But if you're lucky enough, you can find a locals that also plays in person. There's other videos that help me and other resources that I'll link below in the description for you as well to check out. This is a good intro video that helped me a lot to get the understanding of the full metagame and different benefits essentially that people would be interested in playing the format as well. And I'll end the video with reasons why I started playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Go format and why would somebody new would even try to play the format itself. And for my Cardfight Vanguard viewers, you're probably realizing that this is a Yu-Gi-Oh! Type of video at this point. This is a Cardfight Vanguard channel, but for April Fools, I decided to do a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck profile, but it is legit. And I put my time, effort into it, and also just a lot of help from the community wherever had ruling questions, deck lists, and all that kind of stuff. So it is a legit deck profile. One reason that I started into Go format is because I wanted to pick up a second card game that I can just have fun outside of my main card game, essentially, which is Cardfight Vanguard. And again, I do YouTube content creation and competitive gameplay. Sometimes you want to do something else, right? But then if you have another card game that has its own metagame and Yu-Gi-Oh! In modern age is rapidly changing, it can be not as easily to go back into it like months later and then find out that your deck is irrelevant, essentially, which is not really the most fun to work throughout. And then also all the effort that you have to like learn about the metagame and etc. So the ban list doesn't change, but the metagame, it really depends on what's being played in those tournaments. So always just think of like, what do I play and what's expected from event to event, essentially. It's also great for people like me that have very busy lives outside of just playing hobbies, essentially. So sometimes you just want to have fun and keep it simple. And if it's a game that hasn't changed, all the experience that you've literally learned up to this point is always going to be used, which is great. It also allows more interaction than with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Like if you don't have a hand trap, essentially, you can't do squat and you might just lose. And I know people have kind of like a disdain feeling with that. You have to play all these hand traps, you have to like break through an unbreakable board and all these kinds of things. This is a lot more quote unquote fair in that sense too. At least you get to play a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Still. So it allows for more interactions with literally setting your cards face down, whether it be monsters or trap cards, and actually playing like Yu-Gi-Oh! 20 years ago. Let me know your feedback on this video too if you guys liked it as well. I like to hear constructive feedback. I may consider doing more videos with GOAT format specifically. I've actually been trying out Chaos Turbo, Elemental Heroes, Zombies, and stuff. So if you wanted to see like those type of deck profiles within this, again, I'm very insightful with my deck profiles, and I also try my best to make it easy to understand for newer viewers as well. So I'd love to hear your feedback about this too as well. If not, I'll just keep sticking with Cardfight Vanguard. And also, if you plan to get some cards to build your own deck, you can support the channel using affiliated links such as TCG Player, Trading Card Mint, and some of the other ones that are applicable to save you some money as well. And if you like this video or you felt like this would be helpful for somebody else, please like and share and subscribe. On to the next one, amigos. Bye.